Imagine, just for a second, sitting in this lush green garden in rural Austria.
Right.
The sun is shining, the air is warm, and you are having a summer barbecue with your neighbors.
Sounds perfect, honestly.
It does, right? I mean, your kids are laughing. They're splashing around in a brand new swimming pool just a few feet away. You smell charcoal, grilled sausages, freshly cut grass.
Just absolute picture-perfect domestic tranquility.
Exactly. It is the absolute picture of suburban normality. But what you don't know, and what the neighbors handing you a beer don't know, is that exactly 5 feet beneath the grass you are standing on, there is a labyrinth of reinforced concrete.
Yeah, and that is just...
And at the end of that labyrinth is a steel door weighing over 600 pounds. And behind that door, well, that's where the nightmare begins.
It is a juxtaposition that almost defies human comprehension, you know? The terrifying reality that utter normality and absolute depravity can exist in the exact same geographic coordinate.
Separated by literally just a layer of topsoil.
Right, topsoil and a few inches of concrete.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Grab a coffee, settle in, because today, it's just the three of us, you, the listener, and the two of us, sitting down to review a dossier that is going to fundamentally change how you look at the concept of a quiet neighborhood.
It really is.
We are looking at one of the most disturbing, perplexing, and honestly, just infuriating criminal cases in modern history. We're unpacking the 24-year crimes of Josef Fritzl.
And we really need to set a boundary right here for you listening.
Yeah, absolutely.
The themes we are exploring today, they involve intense, prolonged captivity, severe psychological and physical abuse, and really just the darkest elements of human predation.
It is heavy.
It is incredibly heavy, deeply unsettling material.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today isn't just to recite a true crime story. We are pulling from a massive stack of sources today. Investigative journalism from The Guardian and Der Spiegel, forensic timelines, and this brilliant academic paper on a concept called systemic blindness.
Which is a fascinating concept.
It really is. And our goal is to answer two massive, baffling questions based on all this. First, why did this happen? But more importantly, how?
Right, the logistics of it.
Yeah. How does a man build a hidden dungeon right under his family's feet in a busy Austrian town and maintain it for over 2 decades without a single police raid?
Well, to understand the 24 years of captivity, we first have to understand the architect behind it. We have to look at his psychological profile.
Because the blueprints of the dungeon really started in his head, right?
Exactly. Josef Fritzl was born in 1935 in Amstetten, Austria. And if you looked at him on paper in the 1970s and 80s, I mean, he was the picture of mid-century respectability.
He was professional.
Right. He went to a technical college, became an electrical engineer, and later built this really lucrative career as a property manager. He married his wife, Rosemarie, in 1956, and they had 7 children together.
So in the eyes of his community, he was just a strict, providing traditional patriarch.
Yes, but the dossier paints a drastically different picture of his internal world. Fritzl was raised as an only child by a single mother.
And he described his childhood as brutally abusive.
I did. He claimed his mother beat him relentlessly, humiliated him in public, and never showed a shred of affection.
Now, obviously, we have to filter a psychopath's self-reporting through a lens of skepticism, but...
Oh, absolutely. But the behavioral patterns that emerged later, they suggest this pathological, all-consuming need for total domination. And that need took root very early in his psychological development.
And the most glaring evidence of that pathology is how he eventually treated that same mother.
Yes. As he grew older, accumulated wealth, and bought his own home, the power dynamic inverted. His mother moved in with him, and he began asserting absolute control over her life.
He restricted her movements, dictated her schedule.
And eventually, he allegedly locked her in the attic of their home. He went so far as to physically brick up her window, keeping her completely isolated until she died in 1980.
He literally bricked his own mother into an attic. I mean, that is such a massive, flashing red flag for spatial imprisonment.
It's the ultimate precursor.
But the sources reveal something even more shocking. Long before he ever started digging out his basement, he was already a convicted, violent predator.
Right. The 1967 crime.
Yeah, in 1967, he broke into the home of a 24-year-old nurse in the city of Linz. He held a kitchen knife to her throat, raped her, and threatened to kill her if she made a sound.
And he was caught, tried, and convicted for that assault.
Wait, the gasp factor here? So he already had a violent conviction on his record.
He did. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison.
How did this guy ever fly into the radar of the police later on? I mean, if I'm listening to this, I'm screaming at my phone. You're telling me this man had a violent sexual conviction, went to prison, and then just flew completely under the radar of social services when he started fostering children later.
It is mind-boggling, but the answer lies in a catastrophic legal loophole regarding rehabilitation.
Okay, explain that because it makes no sense to me.
So he served only 12 months of that 18-month sentence. But the critical mechanism here is Austrian law at the time. To encourage rehabilitation and reintegration into society, the law dictated that certain criminal records were completely expunged after 15 years.
Wiped clean.
Completely wiped clean from the public and standard police databases. So by the time he began the most horrific phase of his crimes in the 1980s, legally speaking, the rape conviction did not exist.
He was a man without a past.
Exactly. He was simply a respectable electrical engineer and a successful property owner.
That is just a staggering institutional failure. It's essentially a legal reset button for a predator. He didn't have to hide from his past. The state actively erased it for him.
Which brings us to how he moved through society and the academic concept of the mask of normality.
Right. The dossier talks extensively about this. And what I found so compelling in the sources is that this isn't just a guy keeping his head down and being quiet.
Far from it. What's fascinating here is that in forensic psychology, the mask of normality is understood not as a passive disguise, but as an active, aggressive camouflage employed by high-functioning psychopaths.
Active camouflage. So they don't hide in the shadows.
No, they integrate themselves into the brightest parts of the community. They accumulate social capital. An acquaintance of Fritzl actually described him to reporters as decent, outgoing, and above all, amusing bloke.
An amusing bloke, wow.
He intentionally weaponized his status. Being a strict traditional Austrian father, an educated engineer, and a wealthy landlord wasn't just his life, it was a shield specifically constructed to deflect suspicion.
It reminds me of like holding a clipboard and wearing a high-vis vest in a restricted area. If you look like you're supposed to be there doing something official, people's brains automatically categorize you as safe, and they just stop processing any red flags.
That is a perfect analogy. And the forensic dossier actually draws a direct parallel here to John Wayne Gacy in the United States.
Yeah, the similarities are chilling.
The structural parallels in their psychopathy are profound. Gacy was a building contractor, a Democratic precinct captain. He literally won the JC Man of the Year award and famously dressed up as a clown for children's charity events.
Both men scored incredibly high on the psychopathy checklist, right?
Yes, demonstrating glibness, superficial charm, grandiosity, and a total lack of empathy or remorse. But they tailored their masks to their specific environments.
Right, because in 1970 Chicago, Gacy performed the role of the industrious, civic-minded American dream. He was the guy you wanted at your block party.
And in rural Austria, Fritzl performed the role of the authoritative, disciplined, successful property owner. He leaned heavily into the cultural reverence for the patriarchal authority figure.
And that is a crucial mechanism of deception. When a predator wears a mask that the specific society inherently respects and values, the people around them will actively ignore the physiological signals of danger right in front of them.
The community's respect just overrides their instinctual unease.
But, I mean, having the psychological drive to dominate isn't enough on its own. To actually pull off a secret captivity of this magnitude, he needed a very specific logistical skill set.
Right.
Being a strict father doesn't teach you how to pour reinforced concrete or wire an independent ventilation system.
Yeah.
His day job as an electrical engineer wasn't just for show, it was the exact toolkit he needed to build his house of horrors.
He engineered a nightmare. And the timeline of the premeditation is where the sheer, cold-blooded calculation of this crime really sets in. We have to look at the meticulous construction phase.
Let's look at the dates, because they prove this was not a crime of sudden passion or impulse. Fritzl began officially applying for municipal permits to expand the basement of his home in 1978.
1978.
That is a full 6 years before he took his daughter Elizabeth captive. 6 years of digging, pouring concrete, and wiring.
And he didn't do this in the dead of night either. He did it in broad daylight, using the geopolitical anxieties of the era as his cover.
The Cold War stuff.
Exactly. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the fear of nuclear fallout was a very real thing. So he told the municipal authorities, his neighbors, and his own family that he was building a domestic nuclear fallout shelter.
Which at the time was a perfectly logical, even responsible thing for a family patriarch to do. But I have to ask about the sheer physical logistics here. The dossier says he excavated tons of soil,
Tons of it.
You can't just put tons of dirt in your weekly trash bin.
Yeah.
How do you hollow out a massive subterranean complex without a fleet of dump trucks raising eyebrows?
He solved the dirt displacement problem with a brilliant decoy. While he was renting excavators to supposedly work on the nuclear shelter, he simultaneously decided to build a large swimming pool in the backyard.
Ah, the barbecue scenario from the beginning.
Exactly. The family was swimming in a pool on warm summer days, completely unaware that the massive mounds of earth excavated for that pool provided the perfect visual cover for the dirt he was secretly hauling up from the tomb he was building directly beneath their garden.
Wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, over 6 years, he just hollowed out the earth.
He did.
I really want to dig into the mechanical specifications of this bunker, because this is where the precision of engineering becomes absolutely terrifying. This wasn't just a padlocked door at the bottom of the stairs.
No, not at all.
To get to the final hidden chamber, you had to pass through a labyrinth of locking basement rooms. 8 separate doors stood between the cellar and the outside world. And the final door, it was a reinforced steel and concrete slab on steel rails weighing 300 kilograms. That's about 660 pounds.
He didn't just hang a heavy door on hinges. He engineered a motorized vault. The door was operated by a keyless electronic code via a remote control unit that he designed and wired himself.
But wait, it's like building a submarine inside a terraced house. How do you move a 660-pound door into place without a crew? You can't just carry that down the stairs by yourself.
The forensic investigation revealed the sheer mechanical ingenuity he employed. He couldn't hire a crew, obviously, so he utilized pulley systems, heavy-duty winches, and hydraulic jacks.
Equipment he just had lying around from his work.
Exactly. Equipment he had easy access to and could justify renting through his property management and engineering work. He brought the reinforced materials down in smaller, manageable increments over months.
Oh, wow.
He poured the concrete into the steel frame of the door after it was already in place in the basement. It was a staggering feat of solitary, obsessive labor.
And here's where it gets really interesting in a horrifying way. He designed the interior to be entirely self-sustaining for long periods. He plumbed in a toilet, a small shower, a refrigerator, hot plates for cooking, and a washing machine.
He even wired up ultraviolet lamps to simulate sunlight and provided vitamin supplements.
Which sounds almost, I don't know, accommodating.
Ugh.
Until you look at the rest of it.
Right, because the architecture wasn't merely physical, it was deeply psychological. He weaponized the engineering against his future captives.
How so?
He explicitly told them that the heavy steel door and the surrounding walls were rigged with explosives and complex electronics. He told them that if they tried to force the door, or if they tampered with the keypad, they would be instantly electrocuted.
Or that a mechanism would flood the chamber with lethal gas, right?
Yes. And this is a masterclass in coercive control. None of that was true. There was no lethal gas supply. There were no electrocution triggers on the door frame. But from the perspective of someone locked inside, why would you doubt him?
Right. I mean, he had already demonstrated the seemingly impossible engineering feat of building the bunker in the first place. If he could build a motorized steel vault all by himself, of course he could rig it with gas.
Exactly. It creates a psychological fortress where the physical walls are almost secondary. He created an environment where he was essentially a god. He controlled the light switch, the water valve, the food supply, and the air circulation.
And that threat of lethal gas was the ultimate insurance policy. It ensured that even when he went on vacation with his wife, sometimes leaving the captives alone with a stocked freezer for weeks at a time, they wouldn't dare try to pry the door open. They were entirely policing themselves out of sheer terror.
And to compound that psychological domination with physical subjugation, we have to look at the dimensions of the space. He installed all of these intricate life support systems, he wired in plumbing and electricity, but he intentionally kept the ceiling height of this bunker at a mere 1.68 meters.
Which is about 5 feet 6 inches.
Right.
So for decades, anyone of average height living inside would have to constantly slouch or stoop just to move from the bed to the hot plate.
It forces a physical posture of submission.
With the trap perfectly set, wired, plumbed, and tested over 6 years of meticulous, exhausting labor, Fritzl was finally ready to spring it, and he showed an incredible, chilling amount of patience. He waited until his daughter Elizabeth had turned 18.
That date is burned into the timeline, August 28, 1984. A day that altered the course of several lives forever and began a nightmare that lasted over 8,500 days.
Walk us through that day.
So Fritzl asks his 18-year-old daughter to come down to the basement to help him hold a door in place while he worked on the hinges.
It was a completely mundane, normal father-daughter chore. She had absolutely no reason to suspect anything.
None. But once she was in position, holding the door, he came up behind her and pressed a towel soaked in ether over her face. The physical overpowered the psychological in an instant. She lost consciousness, and when she woke up, the world she knew was gone.
She was in a damp, dark room, chained to a bed by her waist.
Yes.
The immediate aftermath of that abduction is where the sheer audacity of his mask of normality had to be deployed to its fullest extent. I mean, he had a missing 18-year-old daughter. He had to explain her sudden disappearance to his wife, Rosemarie, to the neighbors, and to the police.
And he utilized a classic, incredibly effective manipulator's tactic. He didn't just claim she ran away, he manufactured the evidence.
The letter.
Yes, he forced Elizabeth, under threat of violence, to write a letter. He then traveled to a distant town to postmark it, ensuring it couldn't be traced back to Amstetten.
And in the letter, she claimed she had grown tired of her family and had run away to join a secretive religious sect.
A cult, essentially, and she explicitly warned them not to look for her or she would flee the country entirely and they would never hear from her again.
If I'm listening to this right now, my jaw is on the floor. I'm screaming at the narrative. Like, how does a mother just accept a letter saying her daughter ran off to a cult? Did the police not check the postmark? Did they not do forensic handwriting analysis?
It is entirely understandable to feel that outrage, but we have to contextualize the era and the interpersonal dynamics at play.
Okay, tell me about Rosemarie.
Rosemarie Fritzl was described by those who knew them as a highly traditional, deeply submissive wife who was entirely emotionally and financially dominated by her husband. If Joseph told her it was true, she simply did not possess the agency to challenge him.
And as for the police, because that's what really gets me.
Well, the police in 1984, rural Austria saw a letter in the missing girl's confirmed handwriting. They saw an upstanding, wealthy engineer with a clean criminal record.
Because of the expungement.
Because of the expungement we discussed. And he was tearfully presenting this letter. In the context of the 1980s, young people running off to join new religious movements or communes was a prominent cultural anxiety. It fit a recognized narrative.
So they just bought it?
They lacked the forensic mandate to dig deeper without evidence of foul play, which Fritzl had meticulously hidden, so the search was effectively closed.
So while the police and her own mother thought she was off in some distant commune, Elizabeth was locked in a concrete box just a few feet below their shoes.
It's just horrific.
And for the first 5 years of her captivity, she was completely alone. The sources detail that he kept her on a literal leash for the first 9 months to break her will. He subjected her to non-stop, unimaginable assault. And over the next 24 years, this sustained nightmare resulted in the birth of 7 children.
The psychological compartmentalization Fritzl achieved during this period is almost impossible for a healthy mind to process. He essentially bifurcated his existence, creating 2 entirely separate realities.
The upstairs family and the downstairs family.
Exactly. Let's focus on the downstairs reality first, because the medical and physical logistics of these births are horrifying. Elizabeth delivered all 7 children entirely alone in that damp, cramped cellar.
She had no doctors, no fetal monitoring, no pain medication.
Nothing. When she went into labor, her only assistance was a basic maternity guide book from the 1960s that Fritzl had tossed down the stairs, a pair of non-sterile scissors to cut the umbilical cord, and whatever rags she had.
It is a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance. 3 of those children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remained in the cellar with Elizabeth their entire lives.
They grew up in a space that eventually, after forced expansions where they had to dig out the dirt with their bare hands, maxed out at 55 square meters. They never saw the sun. They never felt wind on their skin.
Their entire visual world was illuminated by artificial fluorescent tubes.
Yep.
And then there were the 3 children who were brought upstairs, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander. As the cellar got too crowded and the air quality deteriorated, Fritzl hatched another insane, audacious plan. In 1993, 1994, and 1997, he took those 3 infants out of the cellar and staged them as foundlings.
The mechanics of this deception are staggering. He literally placed these infants in cardboard boxes or strollers on the doorstep of his own home.
His own home.
Yes, and he forged new letters from Elizabeth, mimicking her handwriting, claiming that the cult wouldn't allow her to keep the children, and begging her parents to raise them. He would then, discover the babies, call his wife, and present himself as the shocked but dutiful grandfather.
And it worked. He and Rosemarie legally adopted or fostered these children. The upstairs children grew up going to regular schools, learning to play musical instruments, having those summer barbecues in the backyard we talked about.
Completely, utterly unaware that their biological mother and their siblings were imprisoned in a concrete box beneath the garden where they played tag.
We also have to acknowledge the devastating tragedy of the seventh child, baby Michael, who was Alexander's twin. Michael was born in the cellar with severe respiratory issues. Elizabeth begged Fritzl to take the infant to a hospital, get a doctor to do anything.
But Fritzl coldly refused. The baby died after 3 days of struggling to breathe. Fritzl then took the tiny body upstairs, threw it into the household incinerator, and casually scattered the ashes in the garden.
I just can't wrap my head around this. I mean, he's taking his upstairs grandkids, who are actually his own children, out for ice cream in the town square. He's smiling at the neighbors, acting the part of the benevolent rescuing grandfather holding his family together.
Right.
And then he goes home, walks down to the basement, unlocks 8 reinforced doors, assaults his daughter, and sometimes, purely as a punishment, he turns off the power to the cellar. He leaves them in pitch blackness for days while the food in their tiny freezer rots and leaks all over the floor. How does a human brain compartmentalize that? Toggling between extreme sadism and mundane domestic life without fracturing.
It is the ultimate, terrifying expression of psychopathy. To Fritzl, the people in his life were not human beings with inherent autonomy. They were objects.
Props.
Exactly. The upstairs family were props he used to maintain his societal mask of respectability. The downstairs family were possessions he kept in a vault for his total gratification. He didn't fracture because, in his mind, there was no contradiction. He was the absolute ruler of both domains.
But amidst all of this calculated darkness, the sources highlight something that is deeply, profoundly moving. And that is Elizabeth's incredible resilience. She was enduring unspeakable daily torture, but her primary drive was as a mother, trying desperately to protect her children's developing minds.
Her efforts to normalize an entirely abnormal environment are astounding.
Yeah, tell us about the murals.
The cellar was damp, plagued by mold, and occasionally infested with rats that she actually had to kill with her bare hands to protect the babies. But on the mildewed tiles of the tiny bathroom, she used whatever meager supplies she had to paint murals.
She painted a bright yellow snail with a green shell, a purple octopus, fields of flowers, and suns. She tried to give her children visual stimulation, a semblance of a childhood, inside a concrete tomb.
She taught them to read and write using whatever scraps of newspaper or old books Fritzl brought down. Eventually, he provided a small television and a VCR, which became their only window into what the real world even looked like.
They watched nature documentaries and cartoons, trying to conceptualize a world they had never touched. But the physical isolation took a severe biological toll that couldn't be mitigated by a television.
The physiological impacts were profound. The downstairs children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, were severely vitamin D deficient, making their skin translucent and pale.
And because of that 1.68-meter ceiling, the older children developed hunched, crouched postures. Their bone structure physically adapted to the confines of their cage.
And their speech was completely altered. Having only ever heard their mother's voice and the audio from the television, and living in an acoustically dead concrete box, the boys developed a unique, almost proprietary dialect.
When police finally interacted with them, they described it as a mix of animal-like grunts and a sing-song rhythm. They had zero special awareness of the outside world. There's a detail in the dossier that just breaks your heart.
Yeah, about Felix.
Right. When Felix, the youngest, finally saw the open sky years later, he looked up and asked the police, "Is God up there?"
He asked that because his entire conceptual framework of the universe was limited by a concrete ceiling. The sky was an abstract concept he couldn't process until he stood under it.
Okay, this brings us to the most massive, glaring friction point of the entire dossier. I'm completely stuck on the logistics of hiding this. We are talking about massive astronomical electricity bills to run UV lights, ventilation fans, and hot plates 247 in a secret bunker.
That's a lot of power.
We are talking about literal tons of dirt excavated and moved.
Yeah.
We were talking about 3 different infants mysteriously appearing on the exact same doorstep over a span of 4 years. How in the world did nobody notice? How did society fail this completely?
This leads us directly into the core of the academic paper in our dossier regarding systemic blindness and the mechanics of societal apathy. Because the chilling truth is, people did notice.
They did.
Yes, there are anomalies everywhere. But observing an anomaly and taking decisive action to investigate it are 2 entirely different psychological processes.
Let's start with the people living closest to the bunker. Because Fritzl didn't just live in a single-family home, he owned this large building and rented out several apartments on the floors directly above the cellar.
Right, he had tenants.
And one tenant, a waiter named Sepp Leitner, actually had heated, shouting arguments with Fritzl about the utilities. Leitner's electricity bill for a single quarter soared to over 300 pounds, which was an astronomical sum for a small apartment at the time.
He noticed that his electric meter kept spinning rapidly even when he had turned off every single light and appliance in his flat.
He fought with Fritzl, accusing him of siphoning power, but eventually he just let it go.
Leitner also owned a dog, a husky mix named Sam, and we know from behavioral science that animals are highly perceptive to olfactory cues and microvibrations that human senses filter out.
Sam would often wake up at the start in the dead of night, visibly terrified, staring at the floorboards.
Furthermore, whenever the dog was in the presence of Josef Fritzl, it would bare its teeth and growl menacingly. Beyond the dog, multiple neighbors reported hearing muffled knocking sounds, heavy thuds, and occasionally what sounded like children's cries echoing up through the foundation of the house.
I cannot imagine hearing a child crying from a concrete foundation and just going back to sleep. But Fritzl had a perfectly tailored excuse for everything.
Of course he did.
When tenants asked about the thumping or the cries, he confidently told them it was just faulty pipes, or the gas heating system acting up, or the washing machine vibrating against the wall. And the terrifying part is, they accepted it.
This is where we must understand the sociological mechanisms of pluralistic ignorance and normalcy bias. Normalcy bias is our brain's powerful, innate tendency to interpret anomalous, potentially dangerous information through a mundane, non-threatening lens.
Because our brains want to conserve energy and avoid panic.
Exactly. If you hear a thumping in the walls, your brain vastly prefers the narrative of faulty water pipe over the horrifying narrative of a person imprisoned in a secret subterranean dungeon.
So it's like walking through a city and hearing a car alarm absolutely blaring. We have all trained ourselves to completely ignore it. We don't stop and look for a guy with a Slim Jim breaking a window. We automatically assume it's a glitch in the electronics or a heavy truck drove by and rattled the sensor. We normalize the alarm.
Precisely. And that individual normalcy bias is exponentially compounded by pluralistic ignorance. This phenomenon occurs when multiple people observe something strange, but because they look around and see that nobody else is panicking or taking action, they assume their own private concerns must be unfounded. The tenants heard the muffled noises, but they looked at the other tenants who weren't calling the police. They looked at Fritzl, who is a confident, well-respected landlord drinking beer in the garden. So they concluded, well, if this was a real emergency, surely someone else would be doing something about it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the dossier draws another brilliant parallel to the John Wayne Gacy case here to explain this blindness. Gacy buried 26 young men in the crawl space directly under his house.
Yeah.
The smell of human decomposition in the summer heat was overpowering. But when neighbors, or even guests sitting in his living room for parties, asked about the horrific stench, Gacy didn't panic. He casually blamed it on a moisture buildup and sewer gas from a broken pipe.
And because he delivered that lie with the absolute confidence of a prominent, civic-minded host, his guests accepted the sewer gas excuse. They allowed their normalcy bias and the social awkwardness of confronting their host to override the undeniable biological warning signals their olfactory senses were sending them.
Wild.
In rural Austria, Fritzl weaponized a very specific cultural norm to achieve the same effect. The concept of the private zone.
Right. He was fiercely territorial. He strictly forbade his tenants, his children, and even his wife from ever going near his basement workshop or asking questions about his projects.
In a culture that deeply respects privacy, property rights, and the unquestioned authority of the patriarch, his defensive, highly secretive behavior wasn't interpreted as a red flag for a horrific crime. It was simply categorized as the grumpy eccentricity of an old man who wanted his private workspace respected. They gave him the benefit of the doubt because of his social standing.
I can somewhat stretch my imagination to understand the neighbors. Nobody wants to be the crazy person who accuses their landlord of being a supervillain over a vibrating pipe. But what about the state? What about social services? This is the institutional failure that absolutely breaks my brain.
It's staggering.
Authorities legally allowed Josef Fritzl to foster and eventually adopt 3 children that mysteriously appeared in cardboard boxes on his doorstep.
This is undoubtedly the most profound, systemic, institutional failure of the entire case. On 3 separate occasions, spread over 4 years, social workers were intimately involved in legal adoption processes with the Fritzl family.
And on 3 separate occasions, they accepted an absurdly improbable narrative that a missing woman who was supposedly deeply embedded in a restrictive cult managed to travel back to her exact hometown, drop an infant on her parents' doorstep, and vanish into thin air without a single neighbor, postman, or police officer seeing her.
It defies logic.
Why didn't they demand a DNA test? How do you process an adoption without verifying the biological link or tracing the mother?
We have to look at the legal and technological landscape of 1990s Austria. DNA testing, while existent, was not the ubiquitous, legally mandated first step for familial adoptions that it is today. But more critically, the social workers lacked the baseline suspicion required to trigger a deeper forensic investigation.
It just didn't look.
They didn't verify the existence of the supposed cult. They didn't conduct forensic handwriting analysis on the notes left with the babies.
Because they saw what Fritzl wanted them to see.
Exactly. And crucially, we have to return to that expungement law. When social services ran a mandatory background check on Josef Fritzl to approve the adoptions, the database came back completely clean.
They didn't see a convicted violent rapist.
No, they saw a financially stable, married, property-owning grandfather who was tragically but nobly stepping up to care for the abandoned children of his troubled daughter. His social capital completely blinded the regulatory agencies.
So the perfect crime held up. For 8,516 days, the engineering held, the psychological terror held, and the systemic institutional apathy held. But after 24 years, it wasn't a brilliant, hard-nosed detective who finally broke the case. It wasn't an auditor noticing the spinning electricity meter. It was a biological failure that all of Fritzl's concrete and steel couldn't fix.
The unraveling began in April 2008. Kirsten, the eldest daughter who was born in the cellar and was now 19 years old, fell desperately, critically ill.
From the conditions, right?
Yes. Living her entire developmental life in a damp, unventilated basement with poor nutrition had taken a catastrophic toll on her immune and organ systems. She suffered multi-organ failure, specifically severe acute kidney failure. She was agonizingly close to death.
Elizabeth knew her daughter was slipping away. She spent days begging, pleading, and physically fighting with Fritzl to take Kirsten to a hospital. She watched her daughter writhe in pain and slip in and out of consciousness.
Finally, on April 19th, the pressure became too much, even for a psychopath's rigid control system. Fritzl realized a horrific logistical truth.
That if Kirsten died in the cellar, he would have a 19-year-old's decaying body in a sealed bunker. He couldn't burn a full-grown adult in the household incinerator like he did the infant. The smell would be undeniable, and the whole operation would unravel.
Driven by self-preservation, not empathy, he made the fatal decision to interact with the outside world. He agreed to take Kirsten to the Landesklinicum Amstetten hospital.
But he needed a cover story. So he forced Elizabeth to write yet another fake note, claiming she was still in the cult, that her daughter was sick, and she was leaving her for her parents to seek medical treatment.
He carried the unconscious Kirsten up the stairs, put her in the back of his car, and drove her to the emergency room, presenting the note to the triage nurses.
But here is where the normalcy bias finally, permanently shattered. The medical staff at the hospital, specifically a doctor named Albert Reiter, they didn't buy the cult story. They didn't care about Fritzl's respectable sweater or his confident demeanor.
Dr. Reiter and his team were the first professionals in 24 years to look at the evidence purely objectively, through the lens of empirical science. They looked at the patient on the bed.
And what did they see?
They saw a 19-year-old girl in critical condition with advanced organ failure, severe vitamin D deficiency, translucent skin, and rotting teeth. They realized this girl had absolutely no medical records whatsoever, no vaccination history, no dental records, nothing. She essentially did not exist.
And then they read the note. From a medical logical standpoint, it made zero sense. If a secretive cult wants to stay hidden, why would they risk exposure by returning a dying member to a public, state-run hospital?
The clinical anomalies were too massive to ignore. Dr. Reiter and his team alerted the local police. But they also did something incredibly strategic. They bypassed the slow, bureaucratic channels and went directly to the media.
Oh, wow.
They issued a public nationwide appeal directed specifically at Elizabeth Fritzl, stating on television and in newspapers that Kirsten's life depended on her biological mother coming forward immediately to provide a medical and genetic history.
That public broadcast changed the dynamic entirely. Fritzl was suddenly under immense, uncontrollable pressure. The hospital and the police were actively, aggressively searching for Elizabeth. He knew the net was closing, and his control was slipping.
So, in a desperate, arrogant attempt to defuse the situation and control the narrative, he decided to stage a miraculous return. On April 26, 2008, he went down to the cellar and told Elizabeth, Stefan, and Felix that they were leaving.
He brought them upstairs into the light and told his wife, Rosemarie, that Elizabeth had finally decided to leave the cult and come home with her 2 other children.
But the police were already highly suspicious of Fritzl, following a direct tip-off from Dr. Reiter regarding his bizarre hovering behavior at the hospital. Police intercepted Fritzl and Elizabeth together near the hospital grounds. They detained them both and took them to the station for questioning.
And the police officers conducting the interview immediately sensed the terror. They noticed that Elizabeth was practically paralyzed with fear whenever Fritzl was in the room or even looking at her. So they made the crucial decision to separate them. They put Elizabeth in a private, secure room.
And this is the fulcrum point of the entire case. The officers sat with her and made a profound promise. They looked at this frail 42-year-old woman who had been locked in a concrete box since she was an 18-year-old girl, and they promised her that if she told them the truth, she would never, ever have to look at her father again. They guaranteed her safety.
That promise of absolute security was the key that unlocked the 24-year secret. Over the next 2 hours, Elizabeth broke down and poured out the entire horrific story. She confessed to the ether, the dungeon, the daily rapes, the solitary births, the death of baby Michael, the staged foundlings, everything.
The police were stunned. They immediately arrested the 73-year-old Josef Fritzl. And true to his cowardly nature when stripped of his power, he didn't even put up a fight. He surrendered the electronic code to the 300-kilogram steel door.
When the Austrian anti-terror units descended into that basement, they navigated the labyrinth, punched in the code, and found exactly what Elizabeth had described. The perfect, engineered hell, complete with the children's murals on the damp walls.
The trial took place in March 2009 in St. Pölten, and it is infuriating to read how, even in the courtroom, Fritzl's defense team tried to manipulate the narrative using that same old mask of respectability.
Yeah, his lawyer, Rudolf Mayer, appealed to the jury to see Fritzl as a human being, not a monster. He actually brought up the fact that Fritzl had once brought a small plastic Christmas tree down into the cellar, offering it as evidence of his paternal humanity.
A plastic Christmas tree used as a defense for a quarter-century of enslavement.
It's sickening.
But the lead prosecutor, Christiane Burkheiser, was brilliant. She understood that words weren't enough to convey the horror. She needed to break through the jury's own normalcy bias. She didn't just describe the bunker, she used a visceral visual aid.
Right. She walked over to the grand, tall courtroom doors and physically marked the height of 1.68 meters, 5 feet 6 inches. She forced the jury to stare at that low mark and physically realize that an entire family had been forced to exist below that line for their entire lives.
She also passed around a sealed box containing moldy, damp items recovered from the cellar, forcing the jury to literally smell the decay of the prison.
Initially, Fritzl was defiant. He pleaded guilty to incest and false imprisonment, but he vehemently denied the charges of murder regarding baby Michael and the charges of enslavement. He arrogantly thought he could beat the life sentence.
But the prosecution had a devastating counter. They played an 11-hour videotaped testimony from Elizabeth. She didn't have to face him in person. She recorded it in a secure location prior to the trial.
But there is a massive twist regarding Elizabeth's presence. While the video played, Elizabeth was actually in the courtroom.
Yes.
On the second day of the trial, she secretly snuck into the visitors' gallery. She was wearing a disguise, a heavy wig, and thick glasses, so she could anonymously watch the man who broke her finally face justice.
And Fritzl recognized her, even through the disguise. His lawyer noted that the exact moment Fritzl made eye contact with Elizabeth in the gallery, he went completely pale. He physically broke down.
The sheer psychological weight of seeing the woman he had completely dominated, who he thought of as his possession, suddenly sitting free in the light watching him be judged, it completely shattered his resolve.
The very next morning, he approached the judge and changed his plea to guilty on all charges, including the murder by neglect of baby Michael. He was sentenced to life in a specialized psychiatric prison.
Justice was served in the legal sense, but the aftermath for the survivors is where the real, agonizing complexity of trauma and neurodevelopment comes into focus. We started this deep dive by talking about the murkiness of psychology versus the precision of engineering. There is nothing murkier or more difficult than the unprecedented task of trying to merge the upstairs family with the downstairs family.
It required a massive, multidisciplinary medical and psychological effort. The children from the cellar had to be placed in a highly secure, specialized psychiatric clinic. The physical rehabilitation alone was daunting.
They had to wear dark sunglasses indoors for weeks because their retinas, having never been exposed to natural sunlight, were incredibly sensitive and prone to damage. They had to undergo intensive physical therapy and orthopedic bracing to correct the severe skeletal issues, like Stefan's crouched gait from walking under that 1.68-meter ceiling his entire life.
And the psychological gap they had to bridge was staggering. You have the upstairs kids, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, who are dealing with world-shattering survivor's guilt. They had to reconcile the fact that the grandfather who taught them to ride bikes and took them for ice cream was actually the monster who tortured their biological mother directly beneath their bedrooms.
Meanwhile, the downstairs kids were undergoing sensory overload. They were literally learning what the sky was, experiencing wind, learning how to walk on uneven grass, and trying to understand how to interact with human beings who weren't their captor or their mother. They had to build an entire conceptual model of the world from scratch.
The revelation of this crime also triggered a massive necessary legal reckoning in Austria. The state had to face its own systemic blindness. They completely overhauled their child protection and foster systems.
Which was long overdue.
Yes, they instituted the constitutional law on the rights of children, which mandated vastly stricter oversight, mandatory DNA testing, and deep background checks for any adoptions or fostering. They also fundamentally changed their data seizure and privacy laws.
They gave police the legal tools to investigate hidden physical spaces and digital records much more aggressively, ensuring that the cultural norm of the private zone could never again be used as an impenetrable shield for predators. It makes you wonder about the spaces around us right now. To you, listening to this, I think the biggest takeaway from this dark dossier is a reflection on the fragility of our own perception. It shows us that monsters don't always look like monsters.
They really don't.
They don't always lurk in dark alleys wearing trench coats. Sometimes they wear active camouflage. They are the wealthy landlord, the polite neighbor who waves to you over the fence, the successful engineer next door who seems a little eccentric but perfectly harmless. It challenges us to think critically about the normalcy bias in our own lives and in our own communities. When we hear the metaphorical car alarm or the knocking in the pipes, do we investigate? Or do you just turn up the TV and walk away?
It proves that the mask of normality is incredibly effective. But it is also deeply fragile once society actively decides to stop accepting the easy, comfortable answers. The systemic blindness only functions when we collectively choose not to look closer. And if we connect this all the way back to the beginning, to the mechanical precision of that underground bunker versus the murky depths of human apathy, well, this raises an important question.
Wait, so if Fritzl never had that medical emergency with one of the children, do you think he ever would have stopped? Or would that basement still be a secret today?